Look, thank you very much. It is a great honor for me to be back, and I really hope we can get back to live ones. I really did enjoy the last one on Long Island. That was a wonderful event.
Thank you.
Just got to take off a little sign here. Okay, what I wanted to talk today about is about health. This is a conference about health. And I suppose one of the really important areas of health that they don't like to talk about, and that's pesticides. So I just want to share my screen, and can everybody see my screen now? I hope so.
We can see it. Look, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, it's just Zoom's been throwing up all these things that I don't need. So I've worked my way through it. Now, what I really wanted to talk about is how glyphosate and other pesticides in food are damaging our health and the health of our children and the planet, the one that is killing most people. And according to the World Health Organization, it's non-communicable diseases such as heart disease, stroke, cancer, chronic respiratory diseases. And it's an invisible epidemic. I suppose the word we use now is pandemic because it is global. Poverty and ill health and destroying lifestyles around the planet. The thing is about these diseases is that we cannot catch them from other people. You don't get infected by them. You can't get cancer or stroke or heart disease or autoimmune diseases or Alzheimer's or hormone disruption, ADHD, bipolar, autism, because you're sitting next to someone or you're not wearing a mask. These diseases have multiple causes that are environmental and lifestyle. And this means that we can actually prevent them by changing our habits, our food, our diet, and avoiding the environmental exposures. And pesticides and chemicals have a major causative role in this. Hopefully everybody can see that again. So before I was lost, what I was explaining that the majority of people get their exposure to small amounts of pesticides from food, not from farming. And we're told that these small levels of pesticides in our food are safe because they've been scientifically tested to ensure safe use. Let's break that down, deconstruct it. Most of the pesticides formulations that are sold on the market are deemed safe because they have tested only one of the ingredients, the active ingredient that the manufacturer nominates. They haven't tested the whole formulation, which is all the solvents and adjuvants and synergists and other chemicals in it. And quite often that 1%, so that one ingredient may be only 1% of the formulation that is sprayed on our food. It's actually a data-free assumption to assume there is no difference in the active ingredient and the formulation. It actually defies scientific credibility. So they call these other ingredients inert. And not inert, they're chemically more effective at killing. In other words, more toxic. However, they assume that they are not more toxic. And the last thing we have on these actual formulations, these are what are sprayed on our food, shows that they can be sometimes hundreds of times more toxic than the actual ingredient. There is some testing of the whole formulation for what they call the acute exposure. In other words, how much is needed for you to die within 2 weeks of being exposed to the chemical. And that's what they talk about most of the time when they say, oh, you've got to eat a truckload of this to have any bad health effects. The trouble is with this 2-week exposure before you die, it tells you nothing about long-term exposure that will cause diseases that don't kill you in 2 weeks, like cancer, heart disease, strokes, birth defects, and so on and so on. So in the US, there's about 1,400 registered agricultural and veterinary chemicals. And there is zero testing for any of these long-term health effects, and particularly for children's health, reproductive health, birth defects, cancer, developmental neurotoxicity, epigenetic mutations, hormone disruptions, immune system disruptions, metabolic systems disruptions, and so many other disease issues that can come from these formulations. The fact is, there is only one credible, independent, peer-reviewed, published scientific study of what happens over a lifetime with getting the small amounts of pesticides, normal amounts of pesticides we get from food. That if you eat conventional food, this is what you get. One scientific study in the whole world. And that study showed that there were mammary and other tumors, mammary tumors is let's call it breast cancer, call it what it is, liver, kidney damage caused by regular exposure to small amounts, in this case, of Roundup. And these small amounts are based on what the average American will have. If we look at this other picture here, sorry, I should have gone back here and actually see, the poor rats here with the cancers. Here, it shows the lesions, the damage done by GMOs and Roundup to these animals, to their livers and kidneys. So what I wanted to show you here is that people's health organs are being damaged by having these very small amounts of pesticides, for having them often throughout their lifetime. Well, and that was just looking at one pesticide, but the reality is that our regulatory authorities approve multiple types of pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, to be used in each crop. And all of them are generally used in a normal crop cycle. So this means that many foods, actually most foods, have multiple residues. There was a really good study just come out by the Environmental Working Group last week. Around 23 different pesticides in the average strawberries in the US. That's the level of residues. When we test people, because people eat more than one type of food, so they're getting a cocktail of pesticides. Most people have multiple residues in their body, and yet there is no requirement for testing of these chemical cocktails. Even though they are approved, zero requirement to test. What the science shows that many of these mixtures are synergistic. 1 + 1 can equal 3, 4, 5. Actually, we know it can equal 1,000 in cases, not 1 and 1 equals 2. With data shows up to 232 different chemicals found in the placental cord blood of newborns. And the trouble with our regulatory authorities, it's a data-free assumption to assume that there's independent science shows that these chemicals can be hundreds and thousands of percent more toxic than on their own. What I really want to talk about too, and I will end on this one because so further down I'll go into more detail about this, is that the special requirements of the fetus, the newborn, and the growing child in relationship to what they call developmental neurotoxicity. This is where small amounts of chemicals poison the nerves and stop them from developing properly. And this is another data-free assumption. And there is, once again, no regulatory approval process to specifically test for these groups. And the peer-reviewed science, and I'll go into detail about that later on in this presentation, shows that these groups are particularly vulnerable. Yeah, so I'll just go back to where we were before we lost signals and things. The graph here is, the standard 400-year-old concept of toxicity. The more you have, the more poisonous it is. The less you have, the less poisonous it is. And it seems fairly logical, but and to a degree, it's true for a lot, probably most things, but it's not true of all things. And there is what modern science has discovered, that there's an effect called a non-monotonic dose, and that is when you start getting down to very low levels, there can be an increase in toxicity. It's not a straight line. And many pesticides, and also a lot of the plasticizers, in other compounds used in our food wrappings and detergents and children's toys and makeup, many of these compounds become more toxic at the lower dose, and they actually act like hormones at these doses. They interrupt, they disrupt our normal hormone systems. And health requires hormones to be in balance. It's called homeostasis. When you start interfering with them, and our hormones go out of balance, the whole of our health goes out of balance. What we find with a lot of these chemicals, and there's at least 400 known pesticides and ingredients in pesticides that act this way, not one or two, they can act like estrogen and interfere with the normal development, particularly in the children and the fetus, interfere with their normal development of the whole sexual hormone side. But there's others that also interfere with thyroid and many other hormones. But if we just talk about the ones that act like estrogen, later in life, they are implicated in the epidemic of cancers of the sexual tissues that we have, which is breast, ovarian, cervical, endometrial, prostate, and testicular cancers. They're also implicated in numerous reproductive problems. At the moment, endometriosis is really a silent pandemic that the medical profession is only starting to recognize. It doesn't know what to do about it. Ovarian insufficiency, which is a major issue in people having trouble, having families. We're seeing falling sperm counts, which is another major contributor. Abnormal sperm, and then birth defects in young boys. And we actually have data now knowing that this can actually be caused by our grandparents' exposure, because the fact is, the egg we came from formed inside our mothers when she was being formed inside our grandmother. Our grandmother's exposure can affect us today, and our exposure can affect our grandchildren. The other one we're told is that the new pesticides aren't like the bad ones, like the bad old DDT, and they break down rapidly. Well, if that was the case, they break down rapidly, they biodegrade, and we don't have to worry about them. Why do we have to have maximum residue levels and acceptable daily intakes? Why? Because they leave residues in food. And we know multiple residues of multiple pesticides in food. And most people have them. The other thing too, that the other mythology is, when they break down, they go down to nothing. They just disappear, harmless. There are whole groups of pesticides, when they break down, they become more dangerous, more toxic, more residual. Hundreds of times, in fact. And there's a lack of testing about that. It's a major issue in pesticide residues. This idea, look, the residues are so small and that they're biodegrading. Yes, they are biodegrading, but now they are worse and more toxic. And then what I really want to bring up is the issue of the people who are supposed to be protecting us from pesticides, the regulatory authorities. And they actually avoid the gold standard in science, which is independent peer-reviewed research published in reputable journals. They totally ignore it, and their decisions are based on unpublished industry, pesticide industry, commercial in confidence studies. They're hidden from us. We cannot get access to them. Now, the US EPA says Roundup does not cause cancer. So their studies show that it doesn't. But we cannot get these studies. They won't release them. But the gold standard in science shows that it does cause cancer. The other problem is what we call a revolving door. Pesticide industry managers get jobs in organizations like the EPA, and they get to approve their previous employers' products. And then managers from the EPA, for instance, suddenly become vice presidents of Monsanto and other pesticide companies and get these really good salaries. The other thing is that the groups that do the approving, when we can find out who they are, it's mostly hidden from us. But when we do find out, we find out that the majority of them have financial conflicts of interest. They actually get income from the pesticide companies, from the companies whose products they are approving. And this is known as regulatory capture, where the regulator protects the industry instead of protecting the public. I'll use another word. It's called corruption. These people are paid to protect us, and they're not doing their job. They are stealing public money, taxpayers' money. They should be jailed for it. So what I want to end on now is, for me, what is really important is our children and what pesticides are doing to them. The special requirements of the fetus, the unborn, the newborn, growing child, this is ignored. And here I'm going to talk about what's called developmental neurotoxicity. The other thing I could talk about is how the endocrine disrupting chemicals, the hormone disrupting chemicals, seriously interfere with their development at these ages. But we'll just talk about one issue, because we don't have all day to talk about all the issues that affect children. But the real issue here is that there is no specific testing in the regulatory approval process for these age groups. But independent testing shows that these are the most vulnerable. The fetus, the newborn, growing children do not have the protective liver enzymes that we have as adults. Their bodies cannot break down pesticide residues. We can to a degree, they can't. So the peer-reviewed science from the independent scientists show that they are particularly vulnerable to the smallest residues. And these residues cross the placental barrier from mom to the growing fetus. What the independent science shows us is that pesticide exposure in the fetus and developing children causes lower IQs, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, autism spectrum, organ damage, kidney, liver, lungs, reproductive tract, etc., autoimmune diseases such as asthma, lack of physical coordination, loss of temper, anger management issues, bipolar, schizophrenia spectrum, depression and childhood suicide, and also through endocrine disruption, childhood obesity. So I'll give you some examples of this. And this is actually from a peer-reviewed published paper that I'm a co-author along with Dr. Nancy Swanson and others. And we looked at a whole range of diseases in the USA and plotted them. These are diseases that have increased rapidly. And what we did is we plotted them against the increase in the use of glyphosate, which is Roundup. And what you can see here is that you go from a point in the 1990s where, in this case, it's autism. There's hardly any autism, and then it just shoots up, and it's still shooting up. And that's the yellow bars, that's the autism. The red line is the Roundup. And you see they track really nicely. And what, in science will say that correlation does not equal causation. The sale of, cell phones in Finland could track the same way, and there'd be no relationship between cell phone sales in Finland and autism in the United States. However, we have a few tools that we can use to look at causation, and one is the probability that they are linked. And there's a statistical tool called a Pearson's correlation coefficient. You don't have to repeat that or remember that. But essentially, the number there shows that if they were an accident, if they weren't linked, that'd be a 1 in 10,000 chance. So this is huge correlation showing that they are linked. After we published that, we actually got the science to show why they are linked. The brain is our biggest collection of nerve cells. And here's a very good scientific paper showing how glyphosate damages the development of nerve cells. And actually, this paper actually shows the mechanisms, the biological mechanisms, how it does it. And if you have a look at the top, and the control is the normal, no glyphosate, no Roundup. And the next one is the glyphosate. And what you can see here is that the control has this, you can see this long line coming out. That's called an axon. That's what it uses essentially to join to other cells. And the glyphosate one doesn't have an axon yet. Then you look at the second division and you can see the axon. It's got lots of branches. The more branches that they have, the more other nerve cells they can build to build what's called a neural network in the brain. And you can see that the Roundup one is just starting to build this axon. And then when we look at the final one, you can see the difference between them, that the nerve cell of the glyphosate is hardly developed, is hardly making the connections. So what we're seeing is brains where all of the nerve cells are supposed to make the connections for it to work properly aren't doing it. The issue here is that this effect is non-reversible. The good news is that we know now is that brains can build new networks. If we stop the exposure to glyphosate and put these children on healthy diets, they can start building new networks and recover from autism. There's some really good examples of that. The other issue I want to talk about are cancers. And one of the best studies put out was the US President's Cancer Panel, by the US President's Cancer Panel in 2010, showed that 80% of cancers are actually caused by environmental toxins, especially chemicals and pesticides. This is actually very good news, because what it means is that we could end 80% of cancers tomorrow by stopping these environmental exposures, and then use our science on the 20%. Cancer could actually be over very, very quickly, but it's been ignored. But what we're seeing instead is that cancer rates are rising all around the world now, especially in children. They continue to increase. You know, this is the International Agency for Research in Cancer showing that you know, the 13% increase in childhood cancers. I can give you other figures for adult cancers as well, showing, you know, it's still, cancers are still increasing. So this is another graph from the paper that Nancy Swanson and I published. And in this case, we looked at thyroid cancer and Roundup. And if you have a look, going back to 1975, thyroid cancers were going up and down, but not really doing much. And the green line shows what the trend line would be if it had stayed that way. The red line, of course, is the increase in the use of glyphosate. In this one, we've included a blue line, which is the increase in genetically modified soy and corn crops, because essentially it's the increase in these Roundup ready crops that has increased the amount of Roundup that has been used. And once again, this tracks very well. It's a 1 in 10,000 chance that they are not related. In other words, very, very strong probability that Roundup is the cause of this increase in thyroid cancer. After we published it, the United Nations came out with a monograph showing how glyphosate causes cancer. They gave it the second highest rating for cancer, which means they call it probably causes cancer in humans. And that's based on there's limited evidence of causing cancer in humans. The main one they have evidence of is non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and that's what all the court cases are about. What they did say is there's sufficient evidence that it causes cancer in animals. So if it causes cancer in animals, humans are an animal, causes cancer in humans. They were conservative and they gave it the second highest. There's only a few things. There's about 100 chemicals that they've given the class 1 definitely causes cancer. There they have a lot of evidence of cancer in humans. So, you know, I suppose what I want to say there is that, you know, I'm just giving an example of glyphosate as causing cancer. And particularly, we're going to find that it's going to be a big issue in children, and why we need, because they're the most vulnerable to getting cancer. And it's not just non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I wanted to show the thyroid cancer there. There are other cancers that it causes. The other real issue I want to end on is how, getting back to how glyphosate damages development of the nerves, of the nervous system. And for that reason alone, it should be banned, not just because it causes cancer. But there are a lot of other pesticides that do exactly the same in the smallest amounts. and they damage the development of the nerves in the brain. And these are such, chemicals such as chlorpyrifos and other organophosphates do it. Very good science. This picture here is, for me, is actually very sad evidence of what we are doing to our children through exposures to pesticides. This is in Mexico, in Sonora, and it's an example of children who live in a farming area and get exposed to pesticide drift, and children who don't live in a farming area nearby. They're the same age, little girls, 4 years old. The ones that don't have the pesticides, they're going to draw a picture of a person, and that exactly the sort of pictures that you'd expect girls at that age to do. And look at the pictures done by the girls who are exposed to pesticides in a farming area. And there you can see that they can't do anything remotely that looks like a person. That's brain damage, and that's serious brain damage caused by exposure. But that's people who live in farming areas. But most people and most children actually get their exposure through food. And in the case of many children, they're getting their exposure because mom is eating the normal diet, and those small amounts of pesticides are crossing the placenta and stopping their development, their full development. And here I just want to show this. I've quoted 4 very good scientific studies. One of the studies is really concerning. They couldn't find a lower amount that was safe. Now, I want to get back to this. The fact is, because children do not have the enzymes that detoxify, no amount is safe. That's a fact. And most people get their residues, their exposure, from food, not from farming. So I want to end on this one study here. I'm not going to read it all out. I just quoted it to show it's a good scientific one. But the bottom paragraph, we found significant abnormalities in the morphology measures of the cerebral surface. They're talking about the brain, and put that in plain English, they found physical brain damage. And here they've used MRI scans to look at the brains and can see and measure the brain damage that's happened because of the exposure to small amounts of food, pesticides, that our regulatory authorities say are safe. To me, this is criminal. This is child abuse at the worst level ever. Absolutely terrible. You can't blame the moms. Mums and pops. They're told it's safe. They're just buying what's for sale in the shops. They believe what they're told. But here we have clear evidence, and it's being ignored. What sort of society poisons and damages its children? It just stuns me that the authorities who are allowing this should be in jail for the worst type of child abuse. And the other thing I just want to say is that, we can't wait for the authorities to fix it up. They won't. They're captured by the pesticide industry. We have to take control of our own lives. And there is good news. And the good news is, and we have multiple scientific studies showing that eating organic food will significantly lower the risks. In fact, we have really good data showing that, when you test the urine of children, when they're eating a conventional diet, there's pesticide residues. within days, it disappears. We can make an incredible difference. And for me, people say, oh, organic food's more expensive. How expensive is this? There's no price that can ever justify this. Conventional food is just too expensive because you're condemning children to a lifetime of ill health. This organic food is the best value and the best investment. And I just want to say to anyone here who are parents, who want to be parents, start eating organic now and give your children the future they deserve, the best children, best future you can do for them. That is what our role is as grandparents and parents, is to make sure that our children have a future. So I want to say thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Andre, and so glad that we were able to get that in. That was much smoother than the beginning, so that was terrific. We're so appreciative of everything you shared. Andre, before we jump into questions, where can everybody get your most updated books and get in touch with you?
Oh, okay. Look, the easiest way is Acres USA. That's my my publisher. They are on Amazon, but I much prefer that the money goes to Acres USA. It's just a small, family publisher. That are sort of businesses we need to look after. It's just Google Acres USA, and it'll come up, and you can just get them, from them. They're my last two. The Myths of Safe Pesticides is the first book I wrote, and then I did another one where I wanted to concentrate on all the issues with pesticides and children, because I just think it's such an important issue. And then my last book, of course, is to show that we can farm without using these poisons.
Yeah, for sure. Excellent. Well, thank you for that. That's great. And so I want to make sure that everybody here knows how we can get some questions for you. And I see a hand raised already. We don't normally take questions directly from the chat box, but we do ask that you raise your virtual hand. And if anybody's out there that is not sure how to do that, again, in your Zoom window, if you just put your mouse over it, you don't have to touch anything. You'll see different tabs pop up. One of those tabs is called your reactions tab. So you click on your reactions tab, and when you do that, you'll see something that says raise hand. You click raise hand, and we will see your hand raised. And then at that point, when it's your turn, I will call you by your first name and I'll unmute you. And so, Andre, I see that Mike already has his hand raised. So if you're ready, I'll go ahead and call on him.
Okay, I'm ready. Yeah, all good.
Thank you. And so, Mike, welcome.
Hi, Ben. Hi, Andre. Very thoughtful conversation. And I got to say, you made me go down a rabbit hole that I wanted to ask you about. When you said about the glyphosate and the argument that the lower doses is less harmful, and then you pointed out that sometimes the lesser dose is even more harmful, that got me kind of correlating to like homeopathic medicine, where you use severely or radically diluted molecules, and sometimes not even one molecule, the original medicine or compound is in the water, but it has water memory, I guess is the phrase.
Yep.
So is that what you're kind of saying? Is it kind of follows that kind of science or that kind of mechanism?
Look, I think we're going to find there's mechanisms, multiple, and we're just starting to understand now that exactly that you go down to really low doses and there can be a whole range of effects. In this case, when we're talking about the pesticides, they are still measurable. They're still there. However, what they do at that level, they can actually cross. Basically, in our cells, we have these little gates, the best way to say it. And this is where hormones will go in and instruct the cell how to behave normally. Now, with these pesticides and plasticizers and others, when they're very small, they can actually get through those gates and interrupt them. When they're really big, the best way to say it's like a lock and key. Okay, that's the best way to say it. It's like a lock or key. You can put a thin wire in and use it, into a lock and use it as a lock pick. But if I was to get the same steel that the wire is made from and have a bigger bar, I can't fit it in. So it won't work as a lock pick. And that's what's happening in these chemicals. When they get down to really small amounts, they can actually go into this lock, open it up, and these cells think that it's a hormone and react to it when it's not a hormone. So that's why we use the word disrupting. That's what's happening at that level. Homeopathy is another issue again. And once again, I want to say there's good evidence-based science showing that it does work. And that's at a level where you mightn't even, like you said, you mightn't even have the detectable compound, but what you have is a pattern or memory in water. And considering our bodies are 98% water, there's an effect. So yeah, I suppose what I'll say here is a lot we don't know. So much we have to learn on this, and but it's a really important issue.
Thanks very much for that, Andre. And let's go now. Evelyn has her hand raised. Welcome, Evelyn.
Hello. I have a question about glyphosate in the soil. So I think that Mexico is banning glyphosate, but even so, they've been using it to farm for many, many years. So it takes a long time for it to get out of the soil. So should we only be buying stuff from regenerative farms because there's still glyphosate in the roots of the plants?
Look, I suppose I'll even go one step further and certified organic at this stage, because there are some regenerative farms and people use the term and spray up, and use Roundup Ready or spray up Roundup. And so, and the thing about Roundup is that the next crop will actually absorb it. It gets absorbed by the plant and it's inside the plant. You can't wash it off. And we know that exactly that's right. Roundup can last for years in the soil. And one of the things that we do in organic agriculture, we actually test. And generally, we have a conversion time as well to make sure that there is no pesticides taken up by the actual food that people eat. So for me, get certified organic. It's the safest bet.
Thanks very much for that, Andre. That certainly makes a lot of sense. And at the moment, I don't see any other hands. Some more may come in, but if it's okay with you, I've got some questions too for you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And so I guess really the first question I want to ask is just if you could just tell us a little bit about your new book, Growing Life, Regenerating Farming and Ranching Perfect. Tell me more about that.
Okay, I'd love to, because I'm actually a farmer, and this is actually my, I can say, I started in 1971. So now I'm in 50th year of farming. And all that time I've been organic. In that time too, I've worked all around the world, and I've probably seen more farms, particularly organic farms, at different farming systems. So I based this on my experience and what I've seen as the best farms. But what I really wanted to do was change the paradigm of farming. At the moment, it's all about inputs. You got to buy pesticides. You got to buy, chemical fertilizers. And what I wanted to explain, the most important input in farming is called the sun, because what leaves are, they're the most efficient solar collector, and they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and combine it with water, and they make glucose. And glucose is the basic building block of life. You can put glucose together in long chains and make cellulose, which is wood and the basis of plants. But the other way we can put glucose together and make all these other sugars like sucrose or fructose or dextrose or maltose or lactose. Or you can change it again and we make carbohydrates. That's the starches that we eat. Wheat, maize, potatoes. Or we can, once again, modify it a bit more and we make hydrocarbons. That's the oils and fats. And then we can turn around and add a bit of nitrogen to it and sometimes sulfur, and we make amino acids, which is the basis of all our proteins and hormones and our skin and everything. But it all comes from this basic molecule, glucose. And then when we grow plants, all these what I call molecules of life, all these compounds, these sugars and fats and starches and carbohydrates, when a plant grows, about 30% of everything it makes, it sheds through its roots and it feeds the soil life, the soil microbiome. And what the soil microbiome then does is go to work and take all those minerals that are locked up in the soil and exchanges them to the plant. This is actually an exchange in return for getting free glucose and sugars, because these microbes can't photosynthesize, they can't make it. They then give the plant all the minerals they need. And the key to productivity is to increase leaf area, increase solar energy. The more solar energy we can get into our system, the more of these molecules of life, the more productive. And I want to get this message across. Instead of buying chemicals, start thinking about increasing leaf areas. So instead of poisoning and killing plants, we need more plants. The more plants we can put in our system, the more productive it is. And it's all based on solar energy.
Got it. Thank you. Let me ask you this. I know you touched on some of this in poisoning our children. You talk about the rigorously tested myth, the very small amount myth, the reliable regulatory authority myth, the pesticides are essential to farming myth, all of these myths. Is there anything that you didn't share in today's presentation that you might want to share now about the book and all of those things?
Yeah, look, there's lots of things. There's our books and with chapters, and so
Love to hear.
I'd probably say there's a lot of information. I'm trying to condense it down to a talk, so I've got to be selective. But I think one of the main ones I really want to talk about is how these plasticizers, things like PFAS, the forever chemicals, and pesticides, when they work as hormone disruptors, what they do is they affect the development of the fetus. What happens when a fetus is developing? Small amounts of hormones are required at specific times. And these amounts of hormones are parts per trillion, that one drop in 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And that will say, it's time to develop eyes, it's time to develop limbs, it's time to develop our reproductive systems. And that small amount of hormone is required at that specific time to trigger the normal development. Now, if one of these chemicals, like a plasticizer, and forever chemicals or a pesticide in parts per trillion interferes with that development, it stops the normal development. These are actually called programming events. You get one shot at it. If that shot is missed, that child will be affected for the rest of their life. It's a really serious issue that is being ignored and should not be ignored. And so that, I suppose, is one area, I suppose one day I could give a separate talk just on that alone, because it is so serious.
I remember you being on stage saying how this type of thing is sheer child abuse.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Think about it. It's the worst sort. Those children now are beginning a lifetime of ill health and problems. And we're seeing it now developing. What is happening to our children with their hormone systems being disrupted.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have another hand raised. It's going to be Wendy. Hi, Wendy. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much. I've been fighting this issue of pesticides for 50 years. And so I know the ignorance of the corporations and the agricultural societies. But my question is, I would like to ask you about pseudo grains, millet, the ancient grains, millet, buckwheat, which is grown in Eastern Europe, and it's a staple. Those heavily sprayed, are those countries, France, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, are they spraying their buckwheat?
Yeah.
They still do.
Unfortunately, they are. And yeah, look, it's a big issue for me. Europe likes to pretend it's best practice, but it's got some of the worst use of pesticides on the planet.
Okay.
I used to spend a lot of time in Europe when I used to be international president of IFOAM, the global umbrella body. Our headquarters are in Bonn,
I know
Germany.
IFOAM too. I know IFOAM.
Yeah. And I know Europe very, very well, and I can tell you it's no better than the US when
Really?
it comes to these US and Canada.
Okay. And so I'd like to ask you this other question. I've bought organically, say for the last 40 years, and my children were raised organically, and they both have high IQs, thank goodness. And I knew that back then. I read Rachel Carson when I was a child. Okay. So I was a Silent Spring. I was educated as a child. I speak to so many farmers, and they're organic farmers, and they're extremely defensive. Because I haven't delved into it, it seems that the government in the United States allows a very low grade pesticide. Is that true? That they do use low grade pesticides that get the approval by the government? I've always wondered that.
Yeah, look, this is one, I suppose, what happens here is that you've got a lot of misinformation put out by the conventional industry saying organics uses pesticides are low grade or they're just as toxic. And I suppose a lot of farmers, they're not scientists. They don't really know how to answer it, organic farmers, but I will. Because, I'm a farmer, but I've also got a doctorate of science.
Thank you.
And so to put it simply, and I'm also someone who has worked on the regulatory side of it, so I know these things deeply. And I'll give you an example. For instance, copper sulfate can be used as a fungicide in organics, and you'll get people say, "Oh, copper is toxic." Well, yes, it is in very high amounts, but the fact is, we have to have copper. Without copper, we die. So small amounts of copper is actually beneficial for us. And most people are actually deficient in copper. So, and the amounts that we allow will never cause a problem. That we have good science. The other thing, I'm talking about, that's probably one thing that's residual. The majority of other pesticides, such as natural pyrethrum, which comes from the chrysanthemum flower,
yes,
it breaks down 24 hours. So there is no residue on organic food. And another thing we might use is vegetable oils, the same vegetable oils that we eat. Salad oils. That's not going. If there's a bit of residue of a salad oil on food, it's not going to hurt people. So, what we do is we make sure that it's natural, not synthetic. It, in most cases, won't leave any residues whatsoever, zero residues. So consumers will never get anything. And if it does leave a residue, it's actually beneficial, not harmful.
okay. And my
And-
third question will be about the honeybees. Nobody is looking for the glyphosate in the honey. Am I
Yeah.
correct? And how do
Yeah.
we go? I mean, for example, I'm in California, and I see the word local raw unfiltered honey, but I'm worried that they're getting their honey where all the farms are that are full of pesticides.
Yeah.
So
And you'll find you're exactly right, Wendy. And if you test it, you'll find not just glyphosate, but multiple pesticides in honey. And, one of the main pesticides actually causing the decline in bees, neonicotinoids, the EPA just reversed its decision to ban them as allowing them back again. These they're pesticides related to nicotine, and they're not just damaging to bees, they're damaging to everything. And they're another example, by the way, of a pesticide that becomes more dangerous when it breaks down. The older it gets, the more toxic it is.
yeah. So do we buy our honey from New Zealand, the prized Manuka honey? Do you think that is, or do we buy it from the Himalayas? I have friends that have imported from the Himalayas.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, the Himalayan one is actually very good, and also South Indian, some that are collected. There's actually the forest oil is actually wild collected, and that's really good honey. So, yeah, New Zealand, I know they have their lovely clean and green image, but I can tell you they're like Europe, pesticides everywhere. Manuka honey will have just as many pesticides as something from California.
Okay, so is there organic certification
Yeah.
reliable from New Zealand?
Yeah, look, the organic certification in New Zealand is good. I know the people well there, and you can trust it.
Okay.
And so I'd once again only buy organic honey where there's been a rigorous process to ensure that those bees don't go and forage on conventional farms and get all the pesticide residues in the honey.
Right. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you. And I've got a couple more questions for you. Well, you were just talking about bees. How have the number of pollinators changed in the last 25 years, and why do you think that is?
Where they've crashed. And not just bees, there's a whole range of other pollinators, but the word insectageddon, insect numbers have crashed around the world. And this is a real issue because there's a whole food chain of other animals, birds, lizards, reptiles, frogs, all rely on insects for food. And so they're crashing. And so what we're seeing now is just crash of ecosystems. Bird numbers in the US, for instance, are just plummeting. But same with frogs, same with reptiles. And that then has flow-on effects all through the ecology, all through the food chains. And the real reason why insects have crashed, pesticides. Indiscriminate use of pesticides in systems instead of using, and what I talk about in my book, I have a whole chapter on it. This is my latest book on how instead of killing insects, we can grow host plants to bring in the beneficial insects so we can restore the natural ecology and keep insects in balance. We don't even have to spray organic pesticides. I haven't sprayed an organic pesticide on my organic farm for 20 years by doing this.
That leads to my last question, and I feel like a child asking it, but why have we grown so comfortable spraying pesticides on our crops and on our lawns? Like what has come over all of us? What's going on? What are we doing?
Yeah, look, Stephen, I wish I could answer that. If I knew the answer to that, we'd know how to reverse it. And It's something I struggle with. That's why I've written 2 books on pesticides. To the first one I wanted to call it The Myths of Safe Pesticides, because people spray it because they believe it's safe. And we have to deconstruct these myths. But, the big trouble is we just don't have mass media. And I just wish we could get the same amount of exposure as these, trillion-dollar pesticide cartels have, so we could get our messages out there to tell people, what I love about you is the real truth about health. If only today we're speaking to millions and not hundreds. That's what we need to do to win this battle.
And we will continue to take these recordings of this and others and put them out there and share with as many people as we possibly can. You can count on that. And with that, Andre, I really want to thank you so much for being here. Thanks for grinding through the tech difficulties. We're so glad we got that figured out, because everything you shared was just so vital for all of us. And we're glad that you came back again this year. And I just want to thank you all over, but I know I'm not the only one. We're going to ask our tech team to unmute our entire audience. I have a feeling they want to thank you as well.